Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're spending some time with Dr. Job Martin, the man behind the Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution series. Unlike Kent Hovind, Dr. Martin is a real doctor. A doctor of dentistry, that is. Well, at least he has some real credentials under his belt. Let's see what he has to say.
When I first began to move from being an evolutionist to being a creationist, and my dental students had challenged me, we began to look at the assumptions behind evolution, which I had never looked at before, was never taught. Now, an assumption is a guess. It might be a good guess. It might be an educated guess, but it's still a guess.
Not quite. In layman's terms, yes, assumptions are guesses. In science, an assumption is an auxiliary hypothesis that is taken as true for the purpose of interpreting a particular test. All scientific tests rely on assumptions, and a wrong assumption can cause the test results to be incorrectly interpreted. But fortunately, it's possible to test the assumptions individually. And if you take this to mean that you can cherry-pick whatever science agrees with your conclusions and ignore the rest, you're missing the point. You, that is, creationists, are starting with your conclusion as an assumption and working backwards from there. Scientists are assuming some basics without which science would be impossible. For instance, that there are natural causes for things that happen in the natural world. Evidence from the natural world can be used to learn about these causes, and there is consistency in the causes that operate in the natural world. In fact, these are three basic assumptions that all science needs in order to operate, and none of them have been found to be wrong in any way. In order for creationism to be true, all three of them have to be wrong. So we're not just talking evolution here, we're talking all of physics, chemistry, and biology.
All right, so the first assumption behind evolution is that what they call spontaneous generation occurred.
Wrong. Dead wrong. Couldn't be any more wrong. If you were any wronger, the TARDIS would have to be used to support the resultant paradox. If you look up spontaneous generation on Wikipedia today, you will see in the first sentence that it is an obsolete body of thought. Spontaneous generation was the thought that life had an inherent energy, and when you die, that energy disperses in a way that produces flies and maggots and such. It has never been an assumption of evolution. It is the idea that rather large and complex life can arise out of basically nothing, which goes completely counter to the theory of evolution. You're probably thinking of abiogenesis, and using the term spontaneous generation as a way of poisoning the well, making it look like evolutionists rely on old, obviously outdated, and demonstrably wrong assumptions when they don't. This is an incredibly ignorant thing to do at best, and deliberately deceptive at worst.
Now, all that is when they say spontaneous generation, in this context, all that means is somehow dead chemicals came to life.
In order for it to be dead, it had to first be alive, which, depending on how you look at it, could actually have been part of the idea of spontaneous generation. With abiogenesis, though, what's being suggested is that naturally occurring chemicals combined in a solution in a way that produced self-replicating molecules, which would not necessarily be considered alive. But once replication begins, the process of natural selection can then take over, with selection pressures guiding the replicating molecules towards greater complexity over time. The assumption built into evolution is simply that life started at some point, and it was very simple. The assumption that life started is validated by the fact that life exists, and the assumption that it was very simple in the past is supported by the fossil record, genome sequencing, mitochondrial DNA analysis, and more.
There was no life, and then all of a sudden,
in this case being a few thousand years at the absolute minimum,
in some sort of primordial ooze, here comes something that's alive and is somehow able to reproduce itself.
We're not starting with something alive, we're starting with a self-replicating molecule that isn't alive. The scientific consensus is that the first molecule is RNA, and they've made quite a bit of progress in demonstrating that RNA could form by itself in the conditions of the early Earth. We will probably never know for sure, but that's where most of the evidence is pointing now. I'm including a link down below to a fascinating and well-sourced article about the possible beginnings of RNA, in which they discuss various experiments that demonstrate that not only can the building blocks of RNA form naturally, but that the conditions needed for RNA chains to form are the same conditions that can encourage the formation of membrane-bound sacs that have properties very similar to cell membranes, right up to the fact that they undergo a simple form of division.
That's called spontaneous generation.
No, it's not. But I will stop correcting that from now on just to save time. Just mentally replace spontaneous generation with abiogenesis every time he says it.
Now, evolutionist Kirkett says that's an assumption. Now, why is that an assumption?
Because it is probably impossible to prove it with 100% certainty. But we are certain that life did start at some point, and since all the evidence points to it being much simpler the further back in time you go, it is a well-supported assumption.
Well, because they can't make it happen. With all of the sophisticated laboratory equipment we have today, we have every kind of chemical you can think of, we have every kind of powerful computer. So on the campuses where I go, I'll say to the professors that are arguing against creation and for evolution, I'll say, okay, look, you've got those computers, you've got the laboratory equipment, you've got every chemical, mix them up, make it come to life. That's all you have to do.
The origins of life took a minimum of thousands of years, but probably more along the lines of millions of years, and you're surprised that scientists haven't done the same thing in less than 200 years? There are so many possible starting combinations of every chemical, as you put it. It will take time for them to find the right combination, and they're getting closer every year. What will you say when they finally do have a breakthrough and create life in a lab? Will you then change your story to, well, they made it happen in a lab, so it's not like it happened naturally? There's already plenty of that line of thinking going on as well, particularly in regards to the Miller-Urey experiment. See my video CTI and the Origin of Life for more information on that. So basically it looks like you'll accept nothing short of brand new life evolving out in nature, which at this point is incredibly unlikely, as anything newly evolved will quickly become food for an already existing life form. Would it be enough for you if we found very primitive life in the subsurface oceans of Europa? Probably not. You'd just say God made it there as is, just for us to find it. Welcome to the ever-shifting goalposts of creationism, ladies and gentlemen.
Because evolution assumes that happened at one time in the past.
Yeah, it does. And you are more than welcome to stuff your God in that little gap and just say that God did it. But most scientists aren't satisfied with such simplistic thinking and are trying to find the truth of the matter. You would save a lot of face in the long run if you just joined the old earth guided evolution Christians and just said, isn't it marvelous how God decided to go about creating simple life and then applying pressures to help it evolve into the amazing diversity that we have today?
All right, now, that's probably the first major assumption, that dead things can come to life.
That's actually a pretty big assumption in Christianity. Unless you don't believe that Jesus raised from the dead, or that he raised Lazarus from the dead, evolution is just based on the assumption that life did indeed begin at some point. Evolution would still be true even if you completely refuted abiogenesis. We'd just have to look for another way that life could have begun, because the assumption is simply that life began, which is pretty self-evident in my opinion.
The second major assumption they make is, most of them make, there may be a few that don't think this way, but most of them say, that only ever happened once.
How is that in any way an assumption required for evolution to be true? Are you saying that the discovery of extraterrestrial life would refute the theory of evolution? Most scientists are of the opinion that abiogenesis only produced one successful lineage of organisms, but that in no way means that it only happened once, just that only one of the possibly hundreds of self-replicating molecules were successful in producing offspring that were also successful in producing offspring, which were also successful. Well, you get the idea.
So now you have the dead chemicals, somehow they come, now they're alive.
You have inanimate chemicals that have somehow combined to form self-replicating molecules. Stop using such loaded language. It's almost as if you're deliberately trying to make evolution sound absurd by using simplistic terms that everyone understands to describe complicated processes that nobody completely understands. I wonder what your motive could be for that.
But it only happened once. Now, why would they say, and why would they assume, which they do, and that's how Kirkett words it, their second big assumption is, hey, it only happened once, life from dead chemicals. Now, why would they say that?
They don't say that. Maybe it was different in the year 2000 when your video was first released, but I doubt it. Anyways, for this part I will simply quote Dr. Nick Lane, who is a lecturer in genetics, evolution, and environment at the University College London, from a 2012 interview with the Naked Scientists. We don't know for sure that life only started once on Earth. What we know is that all living organisms we've ever looked at are plainly related and so almost certainly derived from a single common ancestor. If life arose repeatedly, then all of the separate origins must have disappeared without a trace, perhaps outcompeted to extinction very early on by more successful cells. The fossil record of bacterial cells goes back about 3,500 million years. That's 3.5 billion years. And so far as we can tell, these cells were very similar to their modern equivalents.
Well, because it is the probability of that happening is zero.
How did you calculate that? If it happened once, it's quite possible that it did happen a second time, but life as we know it is so interrelated that the most parsimonious explanation is that it evolved from one ancestor. That doesn't mean that life didn't arise more than once, just that only one line survived.
I mean, just to get an amino acid to become a protein. Let's say a simple protein, 200 amino acids.
Why are you jumping so far forwards there? We don't need proteins yet. In the RNA world hypothesis, the first life forms most likely did without proteins, and the first proteins that evolved would have been much simpler than the proteins that are around today. The ones today use a variety of 20 amino acids, and it's been hypothesized that the first proteins only used about 7 or 8. It stands to reason from this that the original protein chains were much shorter than they are today, so I'm not sure where you're getting your 200 amino acid number, nor am I sure how you've determined that to be a reasonable assumption. But it doesn't really matter much, as at this time evolution of protein is still not very well understood scientifically, but it is being researched. In other words, scientists are once again trying to understand exactly how life started, while creationists are insisting that we should stop and be satisfied with the statement, God did it.
It would be a very simple protein. The probability of these amino acids, all left-handed, now keep in mind, if you throw in a right-handed one, you have to start all over again, all right?
I'm not sure why you bothered to throw that in there. I mean, it doesn't actually matter. The presence of a right-handed molecule wouldn't have confounded the process, it just wouldn't have been included. The main problem with the whole left and right-handed amino acid thing is that in a lab they form approximately equally, but in nature they seem to prefer to form left-handed, meaning that even if the presence of a right-handed molecule would screw everything up, it wasn't very likely to be formed right-handed in the first place, so we're right back at the fact that it doesn't matter. What is cool, though, is that we found a clue as to why nature prefers lefties, and it's basically that through an essentially 50-50 shot, the lefties were formed first, and the ones that happened first are a catalyst for other molecules with the same handedness as themselves to form. I'll link to the article down below, and that goes into more detail. It's a fascinating read. I highly recommend it.
The probability of amino acids getting together, bonding together to become a simple protein is something like 1 to the 141st power. That's a minus 141st power, but so we're not thinking in fractions. That would be a 1 with 141 zeros after it.
I know math isn't exactly my strong suit, but you're way off there. 1 to the 141st power is simply 1. 1 to the negative 141st power is still 1. What you probably mean is 10 to the negative 141st power. And 10 to the negative 141st power is a fraction, so I'm not sure how making the exponent negative avoids fractions. And it would be a 1 with 141 zeros between it and the decimal place. The number of zeros that come after it doesn't really matter unless there's a number down there somewhere. I'd also like to know how you came up with that number. Can you show your calculations? I mean, you're suggesting that it's an evolutionary assumption that this happened once and only once. And even if I grant you that, if it did happen once and only once, then we don't have a complete data set with which to calculate the probability of it happening. If something has only happened one time in the history of the universe, you cannot make probability calculations on it without making some rather wild assumptions yourself.
Well, some people believe there's only 1 to the 80th power electrons in the whole universe.
Once again, you screwed up the math. 1 to the 80th power is, you guessed it, 1. It is quite obvious that there is more than one electron in the universe, so I know you can't mean that. A quick Google search tells me that the estimate is 10 to the 80th atoms, and most atoms in the universe are hydrogen atoms with 1 electron, so the estimate is approximately the same for electrons. Also, that's the estimate for the number of atoms in the observable universe. The whole universe might be considerably larger than the observable universe. But since by definition we can't observe the universe outside the observable universe, we can't really answer that question. So whatever you're about to say about there not being enough electrons or atoms to account for them coming into that particular configuration can likely be dismissed as you're not considering the universe as a whole.
So there aren't even enough possible ways to mix things to come up with a simple protein.
And there we have it. Now, even if that was the correct number of electrons in the universe, and I'm pretty sure that you actually mean atoms here, because that makes a lot more sense, you're ignoring the fact that atoms prefer to form in certain configurations, making some combinations much more likely than others.
And then you would have to somehow get only the left-handed amino acids.
Again, it doesn't matter. The right-handed ones would simply be ignored, and nature prefers forming the left-handed one anyways, so this point is completely moot.
All right, so that's one of the reasons they say, well, it only happened once.
Most don't say that it only happened once. It can't be known how many times it happened, and even if we did say it only happened once, it would not be because we figured out that it was statistically impossible, so saying it only happened once makes it more likely. It would be because there was some sort of tangible evidence suggesting that it had only happened once, which there isn't.
Now that's where they get their tree of life, where they say, oh, look at this. We have this one little cell, and now here comes everything out of this one cell. Here's your plants over here, and all your plants branching off, and over here's all your animals and your fish and all these kinds of things over here.
I can't help but think that you're being deliberate in your oversimplification to the point of untruth. Saying that everything came out of one cell makes it sound like the first cell had its first split and that split made a plant, and then it had its second split and that split made a fish. It paints an utterly ridiculous picture which nobody is advocating. The evidence does, however, suggest that all plants and animals can trace their lineage back to the original life form. The most powerful evidence for this is genetics, where they compare the genome of different organisms and trace the relationships through the commonalities that are found. There is much more evidence out there, and I'll leave a link to the Wikipedia list of evidence for common descent down below, but genetics was pretty much the clincher.
But that's an assumption.
No, that's a conclusion drawn from the evidence. Evolution would still be true even if we found out that there were a few dozen original life forms with surviving lines today. The theory of evolution is in no way dependent on there being only one common ancestor to all living things. That's just the way things look based on the available evidence.
But once they make those assumptions, then another assumption is that viruses, plants, and bacteria, and animals, they're all related.
That's not an assumption, that was originally a prediction, and it's a prediction that has been validated numerous times since it was made.
Now what they do in the textbook is, they'll draw these pictures of life, and they'll have a horse, and they'll have a fern, and they'll have a coelacanth fish down here, and they'll have man way up here, and then some pine trees over here, but they hook them up with lines.
You're right, that's a horrible idea. They should be hooked up with curlicues instead. Someone get me the CEO of McGraw-Hill.
But there's nothing on the lines. Well, why is there nothing on those lines?
Maybe because there's a limited amount of paper available? Are you seriously suggesting that every diagram like this should include all of the millions of species alive today and all of the potentially billions of extinct species? I'll leave a link to a really neat Tree of Life Explorer down below. It allows you to select an organism from the top of the tree, and it'll show you the most recent common ancestor between that organism and humans. And even with it being online with no paper constraints, it is still woefully incomplete, as it ignores most bacteria. Bacteria have far more genetic diversity than animals do, but a tree full of bacteria with a tiny corner dedicated to vertebrate animals wouldn't be all that interesting to most people, so they cut it out.
Well, because those are the missing links. There's nothing there because there's nothing there.
No, those are the ones that don't fit on the paper. How can you possibly not understand that? And keep in mind that a missing link is only missing until we find it. But for each one we find, it creates 2 new missing links. So creationists will just complain about the new missing ones. It seems that the only thing creationists will accept would be a complete ancestral record for every individual organism, as that would be the only way to eliminate all of the missing links. That is, of course, completely impossible, so checkmate atheists, I guess?
But that gives you a picture in your head. Oh, you see, these things are all connected. They're all hooked up. But it's really a fraudulent thing to do because there's nothing on those lines because there's nothing there.
Again, there's nothing there because they honestly can't fit every known organism onto a page of a textbook. There are plenty of links that aren't missing, such as in the transition from our common ancestor with chimpanzees to modern humans. We have, and forgive the pronunciation, Ardipithecus ramidus, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo heidelbergensis. From land mammals to whales, we have Indoheus, Pachycetus, Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Myocetus, Basilosaurus, Dorudon, and Aetiocetus. There are many other transitions that we know very well, and I will again leave a link down below to a page that provides several examples of well-known transitions. And again, I apologize for my atrocious pronunciation. I'm sure it was awful.
So it's an assumption that there's things in here, in between, that hook them up.
You seem to be confusing assumption with prediction an awful lot. It was predicted that transitional fossils would be discovered, so it was no surprise when they were.
They aren't hooked up. All right, well then they say that reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians, they're all related. The fish came out of the water, became the amphibians in the water and out of the water, became the reptiles, which became the birds and the mammals. That is an assumption.
We've already gone over common descent. Do you really need to bring up a specific category of common descent just to rehash it again?
And that's what Dr. Kirkett says. That's a guess, because we don't know, because we can't make it happen.
Wait. Is your definition of assumption just something that we can't make happen in a lab? So you think that mammals being descended from reptiles is an assumption because no lab has been able to breed mammals from reptiles? I don't even know what to say to that. That's completely and utterly laughable.
For instance, if evolution is true, then if reptiles, let's say, became birds, that's what evolution taught me, reptiles first, then birds, so we have a reptile, cold-blooded, dense bones, that's going to evolve into a bird, warm-blooded, hollow bones. Now, is there any such thing as, let's say, a lukewarm-blooded, semi-dense boned creature that's in between reptile and bird?
Well, that depends on what you mean by lukewarm-blooded. To start, let's define cold and warm-blooded. Better terms to use would be endothermic for warm-blooded and ectothermic for cold-blooded. The difference is that endothermic creatures generate heat using internal thermal regulation, and the heat is spread through the body by means of the blood. Ectothermic animals take heat from their environment and store it in their bodies, so their blood doesn't have to be warm, but it's not necessarily cold. Larger ectothermic animals would actually have had warm blood, as their large body mass enables them to retain heat better than their smaller massed cousins. Nobody knows for certain when endothermy evolved, and that's something that's very hard to determine using only fossils, but it is not hard to imagine a medium to large ectothermic animal having offspring with mutations that take advantage of the warmth of the blood to spread heat to its limbs. As far as bone density goes, it's even easier than warm or cold-bloodedness to imagine. As flight evolved, the selection pressures would have been towards lower bone density to conserve energy while flying.
No. You either have a reptile or you have a bird.
Or you have an Archaeopteryx, which creationists almost always classify as a bird, but which has a plethora of reptilian features, as I discussed in one of my previous videos.
And what about Archaeopteryx?
Hey, there it is! I wonder whether you think it's a bird or a reptile. Let's find out, shall we?
Oh no, the leading evolutionary thinkers now are telling us, no, that's a pure bird. That's a pure bird. As a matter of fact, they have birds now that they have found that are before the Archaeopteryx.
Okay, so this did come out in the year 2000, so I don't know for certain what the consensus was at the time, but as I discussed in my previous video about transitional fossils and Genesis apologetics, the idea that Archaeopteryx is a bird and not a reptile is in the minority, and even the guy that they found to say that it was a bird and not a dinosaur also agrees that it's an important transitional fossil for understanding how flight developed. So even if I grant you that it's purely bird, it is still transitional.
And so, what is evolution then? Well, it's a faith system because it's based on assumptions.
But remember, most of the assumptions that you have outlined here are not actually assumptions. Those that are, the one that is not critical to the truth of evolution. Most of what you've called assumptions were actually predictions that the theory of evolution made and have been validated since. So none of it was actually faith-based.
That even today, the leading evolutionary thinkers of our day, they cannot hook up these vast distances between
the words in the sentences. Sorry, I'll let you finish that one in your own time. Please go on.
various types of creatures. Oh, well, you see, those are the transitional forms, now that's the new name for the missing link, you see.
No, that's just the name for it when you find the missing link. By definition, it cannot be missing when you find it. So when you find a missing link between two other species, it's an animal that is in transit between those species. So you might say it's transitional. Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
It doesn't sound as missing if we call it a transitional form.
Because if we find it, it's not missing. If you lost a set of keys, would you still refer to them as your missing keys after you found them under the couch? Why is this so hard for you?
And so, well, those are the transitional forms. Now, we haven't found them yet, but we will. Give us enough time, we will.
We've found at least several hundred of them. We keep finding more all the time. And every time, creationists have to squirm through one excuse after the next as to why they aren't transitional. And so, as someone who has watched a lot of creationist videos, I can tell you the excuses are just often plain idiotic.
Well, what they are finding with the time they have is, and especially now with things like molecular biology, where they can actually go in and look at the molecules. One quick example. Ramapithecus was supposed to be an ancestor of man. It was assumed to be our ancestor. And then you have Vincent Sarich out there at Berkeley, and he does the molecular work, an evolutionist. And oh no, Ramapithecus is an ancestor of an orangutan. Well, it's still in some textbook as an ancestor of man. When it's been proven at the molecular level, it has nothing to do with man.
Yeah, I like your little switch out there. Yeah, it was determined using morphology to have been an ancestor to humans. We then studied the molecular chemistry and found that it fit better as an ancestor to orangutans, and that humans and the other apes would have had to have had a more recent split than Ramapithecus. But you carefully worded it to say that it has nothing to do with humans, rather than admit that it is an excellent piece of evidence for evolution with regards to orangutans. So on one hand, you are accepting this evolutionary science in as much as it shows something not to be an ancestor to humans, but on the other hand, you're dismissing it almost completely, because if it is true, then it validates the theory of evolution, and you can't have that.
So this whole idea of Big Bang macroevolution.
And now, 22 seconds before the end of your video, you bust out cosmology. What the fuck, dude? Evolution has nothing to do with the Big Bang.
Is based on a whole series of pure assumptions.
Well, let's just take a quick look at a few of the assumptions needed for creationism to be true. Assumption. Almost everything that has been scientifically verified is actually wrong in almost all fields, but especially in biology. Assumption. Even though the Earth and the universe appear to be billions of years old, they are in fact only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, even though we have trees older than that. Assumption. A global catastrophic flood occurred around 4,000 years ago without leaving a trace. Assumption. If scientists can't do it now, then it can't possibly have happened naturally. Assumption. If the answer is, I don't know, then a better answer is, God did it. Phew, that was longer than I originally intended. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to support me on Patreon and follow me on Twitter. See you next time.